Well, former President Donald Trump says that he plans to impose a 200% tariff on John Deere if elected. His comments come amid mass layoffs and the company's decision to move some of its manufacturing to Mexico. A 200% tariff would triple the cost of a skid loader. That's according to an Iowa State University economics professor. He says this would hurt both John Deere and consumers, in his opinion. The Republican Majority Leader also criticized the proposal.
I'm not a fan of tariffs. They raise prices for American consumers.
Making parts more expensive for John Deere is not going to help John Deere either, and it probably would not help jobs in the United States. So I think some of this isn't perfectly well thought out.
Now, 200% tariff isn't expected to be imposed anytime soon. Trump would have to go through Congress because of the country's trade deals with both Mexico and Canada.